Hi, everybody. My name is Lisa Keranen. I'm the chair of the CU Denver Department of Communication. Chair is just a fancy word for supervisor. And I'm here today because your instructor, Lisa Dickstein, asked me to talk a little bit about being a manager and being an ethical manager. So that's what I'll be talking to you about today. Now, first, I wanted to thank you for your patience in braving this remarkable semester of COVID-19. I know we had great disruptions to our workplaces, to our student learning, to our lives in general, and we are close to the end of getting through it together. So thank you so much for your perseverance. And to our graduates, I wish you the best of luck in 2 weeks with graduation. And my hopes that the online economy will be hiring hot and heavy in the future. And I do know a few students who've gotten online jobs so far. So all hope is not lost from COVID-19. So I'm here today, as I mentioned, to talk about workplaces and an ethic of care, which is very much my management philosophy. It doesn't mean that work is free of conflict. It just informs how I tend to approach conflicts when they do inevitably arise. And of course, if you're a comm major, you know conflict is part of life. It's not inherently good or bad. The trick is all in how you handle it and if you manage it productively or not. All right, so my goal today is first to give you an overview of what I mean by the term ethic of care, to give some general guidelines for thinking about how to act professionally in workplaces, and then end with a couple of practical tips. So first, let's start with a little bit of background. So when I say the word ethic of care, it is a kind of a fancy philosophical term, and it comes to us from the second half of the 20th century from feminist philosophy, particularly is associated with a feminist philosopher whose name is Carol Gilligan. And the idea here behind the ethic of care is that our moral action, that is our obligations and responsibilities to others, center in our interpersonal relationships. It's one-on-one, but you comm majors know that, where care is a central moral virtue, right? Something to be aspired to. And so the whole idea, again, consistent with feminist philosophy, is that the idea is grounded in the notion of relational interdependency, right? That we, being involved in public life together, mutually affect one another. We know social contagion, communicative contagion is a thing. If somebody comes into the workplace and they're grumpy and they're stomping around the hallway, by and large, that affects things. I always write my staff about midterm time and say, hey, everybody, the students are feeling stressed, right? Let's all work to prevent emotional contagion and be circuit breakers, right? To affirm other people's stress, but not to ingest it and therefore spread it on our own. So this idea that, all parts of the system affect one another, that they are mutually interdependent, means that if I'm going to exhibit care for others, I'm going to really focus on a couple of key values. First is that I'm going to pay attention to others, right? So that's the intention value. I'm going to notice, I'm going to observe, I'm not going to disconfirm or ignore. But that also doesn't mean that I owe everybody an ethical obligation to be an unlimited source of people's attention, right? That I don't have to give myself completely away. But when I'm interacting with people, I should be attentive and I should notice and observe. Secondly, I have an ethical duty to respond. If people bring me problems as a manager, if the problem rises to a certain level, I have to help solve the problem, right? And in some cases that may be hooking people up with resources to help them from human resources or coaching or whatever. In some cases, it may be responding to a policy that they think is unjust, but part of caring for others is responding and acknowledging, letting other people know that you are listening. Empathy is another key value, to communicate to others that you understand where they are coming from. So is respect for persons. That's a big value. If I, as a manager, am ever to communicate disrespect for someone, that's something that breaks trust. And one thing the workplace literature shows is that good managers typically are trusted by their employees. So supervisors who do what they say they're going to do, who mean what they say, who tell the truth, and who handle bad news in respectful and empathetic, compassionate ways are those who are trusted and those who are therefore more effective. And then lastly, and this one is closely tied to trustworthiness, is competence, right? So leaders and supervisors have an ethical duty to execute their jobs competently, to know what they're doing, to seek help and answers when they don't know what those are supposed to be. And then really, if we're kind of to summarize what this ethic of care means from a management perspective, it's that we are listening and responding to others on their own terms, right? Not as you would have others respond to you, but what others would hope that you would treat them. And that's why paying attention and listening and observing others and empathy are such important virtues in the workplace, regardless of whether you're a manager or not. All right, so let me turn a little bit here and talk about distress, fairness, and workers, staff, employees. These roles go by many names. So here again, if I'm applying some of my values from the first column, I want to be able to ask, what if management is seen as an act of care, right? What does it mean to care for and about your employees from a supervisory perspective? Well, again, it means I'm going to pay attention to each of them uniquely. And I have over 65 people who report to me each term. And so, yes, there's a limited amount of attention and care that I can give each one, but nonetheless, I try really hard to pay attention. And I can tell you the unique strengths and capacities of each person who works for me and each student that I have, right? Which is something that I pride myself on doing as an instructor as well. So that paying attention. Secondly, taking responsibility for the overall flow of the workplace, which means having a vision, communicating that vision. It means creating a warm and positive culture in the workplace using all the communication behaviors and techniques that you've probably learned about in your major so far. Again, conveying competence, that you know what you're doing. And I do that as a supervisor by trying to share best practices and state-of-the-art developments within higher ed with all of my staff. And then lastly, being responsive. And in an age of text messages and phone calls and emails and never-ending Zoom, this is probably the greatest challenge for supervisors, because there are more emails than one can ever possibly respond to. There are more phone messages than one can ever possibly respond to. And so one thing for all of you starting out in your career, that's just a little piece of advice that I would give you, is how can you make life easier on your supervisor, right? So do you have to send every email you think you have to send? Do you have to call your boss? Maybe your boss has asked you to, maybe not. And one thing of the reciprocal nature of attentiveness is to figure out what your supervisor's preferences are for communication. And you can do that through direct conversation, or by watching, or by gaining information from their assistant or their staff members, other people who work in your workplace as well. So all of these values I've been talking about because Lisa asked me to from a supervisory perspective, but certainly they apply from the perspective of somebody who has a supervisor. So again, it's a two-way street. All right. So what I think this means for management, if we see it as an act of care, is that strong managers need to recognize that employees may need different levels of care and assistance, right? So for some employees, it's very important that they know that I see what a good job they're doing and how hard they're working. Other people don't care about me at all, right? What matters to them are their students and what their students think. And so again, that attentiveness means I'm kind of always watching what seems to be driving this person, what kind of praise do they want and need. Mostly everybody wants praise, everybody wants compliments, but nonetheless, some people may need more assistance with particular aspects of their job. So it means treating people fairly, but it doesn't necessarily mean treating people equally, right? Equity means that all employees have the same access to a certain level of ability to be successful as an employee. And that may mean that some employees need different approaches or need more or less of particular aspects of workplace resources. I think number one job, and legal statutes uphold this one too, is to establish and maintain an appropriate and safe workplace environment for all. And speaking in terms of higher ed here, this is why faculty and managers like me are responsible, for example, for reporting any instance of sexual misconduct or sexual harassment that we happen to hear about. So we've started to include that on our syllabus that, hey, before you start to tell me what happened at a party over the weekend, pause, because you need to know that I am required by federal law to report it. And that's part of keeping everybody safe. So whether it's lab equipment, in the bio department for keeping animals and student learners and workers in the lab safe, or whether it's creating a safe climate that's free from toxicity and free from inappropriate actions, sexual harassment, racial discrimination, ethnic, religious discrimination, et cetera, that's something that's very important to do. Now, that said, I'm a big believer in strong boundaries, and I think workplaces are stronger when people have very strong boundaries. And we often use the metaphor of the family to talk about our workplace and say we're a calm family. And I do think that on the one hand, it's a positive metaphor because it indicates the degree to which we care for each other. But the metaphor similarly has limits because legally and morally, we're not really a family, right? And all of the dirty linen that might come with a family life, the skeletons in the closet, the problems that people have in their personal lives are really not appropriate for the workplace. And so, on the one hand, we want to be friendly, and I'll say this later, but not necessarily close friends. And so even with my employees that I say that I'm friends with, I'm not sharing or, I'm not really spilling the tea. I'm not going into great detail about my problems and struggles or my triumphs and successes because it's a workplace, right? And it's not appropriate for me to go in there and just start dishing about my life during the workday. So that's another kind of balance that we want to be friendly, we want to be professional, and yet there are lines, that one has to always try not to cross. And I think particularly, when younger generations enter the workplace, there can be a bit of a boundary negotiation with all of that and a learning. And so when I was younger and I was an assistant professor, I would share much more of myself with people at my workplace. And then over time, my opinion changed, and I think I grew as a professional and I grew as a faculty member, and so that didn't feel appropriate anymore. And I'm not saying that every young faculty member does that, but certainly that was part of my learning as I went up through the ranks. It also means that supervisors under an ethic of care need to tactfully, gracefully, gently, while letting others save face, call out problematic behavior. And when you don't, as a manager, call out problematic behavior, same goes true for being an instructor, you're implicitly condoning it, right? So if I have a student who comes to me and complains about Professor X, right? I first of all have to not assume that Professor X did exactly what the student said that they did, but I also have a duty to ask Professor X about it. And then if Professor X did that, then I have to have a conversation and talk through them with why that's not appropriate and what we can do to prevent it in the future. And that's often an awkward role. Sometimes the people that I'm talking to might be full professors, whereas I'm only an associate professor. And luckily we have a great human resources department, and they're very good about helping. We also have ombuds offices on campus. They can help with conflict management and so on. But part of caring for others is being honest with them when things are problematic. And again, it's never easy, it's never fun, but these conversations are really important to creating a safe learning and work environment for everybody. And lastly, I think this means that supervisors have a duty to have knowledge of workplace policies, resources, as well as legal requirements at many levels. As a university, we're subject to a lot of federal regulations. For example, we have institutional review boards, and they oversee our research ethics. So before we do research involving other people, there is layer upon layer upon layer of paperwork that needs to be filled out and approvals that need to be given. And all of those, again, are dictated by federal statute, and we must be in compliance. And part of ethics, too, is being compliant with laws that are just. And so that's something to do as well. And as I'll say a little bit later in the last section of this talk, policy is really going to be your best friend if you're a supervisor who tries to act with integrity. So Lisa wanted to know kind of what happens. She said that you all wanted to know, and she was interested in hearing about what happens when you're a manager, but you're friends with some people and maybe not everybody at the workplace. And that can be a difficult condition to be in. And that's, again, why I am a firm believer in boundaries and have a wide circle of friendships outside of the department in which I work, because I need a release valve. I need a safe space. And it's not okay for me to be talking about, colleagues with other colleagues, right? So, that's really important as well. And let me transition to some of the tips then and practical strategies in this third and final part of my talk. All right, so tips for when you're in the workplace. And again, this applies to managers as much as to people who have supervisors, which is all of us, right? So I'm both a manager and someone who has a supervisor. And it follows, again, this ethic of care kind of principle that underlies the way that I try to be a manager or supervisor. So first is, again, the platinum rule. The golden rule is to treat others as you wish to be treated. But the problem with that is that not everybody else wants to be treated the way that you are treated, right? For example, I don't care if you call me Dr. Keranen. I have colleagues who feel like I worked for 20 years to get my doctorate. Students must call me Dr. So-and-so. Fine, right? If that is your way of being treated, I can deal with that, right? But nobody needs to call me doctor. So treat others not as you wish to be treated, but as they wish to be treated. Secondly, and it bears mentioning again, is to maintain strong boundaries. The workplace is not the appropriate venue for sharing your relational, financial, and other sorts of problems. And that one's tough, especially in a place where people really do care about one another. And sometimes, everybody slips up on this one, but it's an important rule to aspire to nonetheless. Another thing to do when you first start your career and your position that you'll get after CU Denver, you want to really quickly learn and adapt to the culture, policies, and procedures of your new workplace. And don't assume that they should adapt to you. And I remember years ago, we had an employee who we kind of reluctantly hired because during the interview, this employee didn't ask us any questions and was very comfortable talking about themselves, but didn't seem to have done the research on us. And for a variety of reasons, we went ahead and hired this person. And to some extent, in many aspects of their job performance, this person was good. But this person was never interested in learning about who we were. as a culture, and would sometimes say things like, I don't understand what our mission is. And we'd repeat what the mission was because it's on our website. And they'd say, I don't understand. And so it was very strange and disconcerting. And that person's no longer with the organization, either, you know, because it wasn't a good fit or something, but it was very jarring for other employees that this person didn't seem interested in or to ask about the culture of the department and its traditions and its histories and why we did particular things in particular ways. So I think something that you can really do when you leave the university and go further in your career is really show investment in the culture, procedures, and policies of your workplace, which is something your instructor, Lisa D, does very well. The advice, again, that also bears repeating, and I say this to junior faculty, is to be friendly, but not friends with your students, right? You're not friends with them. And sometimes with graduate students, you know, they might be 22 years old and their students are 23. And so it might seem like it's a cool thing to go out and hang out in a bar, but be friendly, but not friends, right? And maintaining that kind of professional line. Now, it's inevitable that some supervisors will feel closer to others, or they work more closely with others, and so they know more about each other, and so on. And so the trick here, and this is a thing that just absolutely must happen, is that policy has to be applied fairly to all. Right? And so as a supervisor, I don't get to have one set of policies for my friends and one set of policies for everybody else. And if I do, I hope somebody would point that out to me, because that's really not cool. So I always tell people I'm mentoring that policy is your friend, right? Because it's written down, it's part of the documentary evidence of an organization. And so it dictates, you know, how things get handled. All right, and the other piece that's really closely aligned, I think, is to be very transparent in decision-making and explain to people what values are informing the decisions that you're making. And, you know, sometimes that's really hard. And I think in COVID, that's going to be really hard because there are grave financial challenges facing the university. We're going to have to make hard decisions about sections and enrollments and cutting classes and so on. And so we have to be very transparent about how and why that is happening and following shared principles, right? So if the university is being asked to cut its budget, you know, how are we doing that across the board? So it's not just people who are disproportionately, you know, at the bottom of the organizational structure who are being affected, for example. Both as supervisors and as employees, confidentiality matters. So if somebody tells me something about a health problem they're experiencing, I can't tell anybody who doesn't have a need to know. So I don't go trumpeting that around to other employees. Somebody has a surgery, somebody had a car accident, only with permission do I share that information, because otherwise it is personal matter. It is a personnel matter. And so, you know, as a supervisor, I am privy to all sorts of things about people's lives when it affects their potential to do their job. And it's super important that I am a vault and that I keep that information inside and only let those who have a need to know, right? So then the other advice that I would give people is to avoid gossip at all costs. I know some communication scholars would say, oh, gossip's a part of the human condition and it's an important form of communication. I'm not someone who believes in that. I think that gossip is something that happens out of a sense of insecurity or a lack of power. And the more I've grown as a scholar and academic leader, the less interested I am in gossip. I don't have time for it. I don't want to hear it. And so one thing that my mentor taught me when I first became a chair was to make sure that your speech is impeccable, right? Make sure that you don't say anything, especially over email, that would come back to haunt you or that would hurt somebody else. And that's especially true even on social media. And I'm sometimes a little bit surprised as a manager by what some faculty at other institutions might post on their social media accounts when I see it. And I think we've seen time and time again examples of people who have been let go from positions when their speech was deemed unbecoming or not in line with the organization's values. And we can talk about freedom of speech and so on, but the lines are somewhat blurry with regard to social media. And so I would say if you are working in particular fields, that becomes even more important. And so make your speech impeccable, even and especially on social media, right? So is it true? Is it kind? Do I need to say this? Is it necessary for me to say this? And so on. So those are just a couple of things that I try to enact in my life as a supervisor of more than 60 some people for the communication department. And they're also things that I expect of other leaders on campus as I look around. And again, that doesn't mean that I don't slip up sometimes and say something I wish I hadn't said, or send an email that I wish I hadn't gone back and phrased a little bit more diplomatically. But nonetheless, I aspire to these each and every day. All right, so what I've done today is outlined my management philosophy grounded in a feminist ethic of care. I've talked about what it means to manage with a sense of care. And lastly, given you some practical tips and strategies to use whether you are an employee or a supervisor. And so again, we're a couple weeks away from graduation. That's very exciting, but I know that this is a time of change and uncertainty. So hang in there, links. The Career Center is available for you for up to the next year. I know our faculty should be available for you too. And so stay healthy, stay strong, and good luck with finals. Thanks so much for listening.